Hey guys, welcome back. So in this video, I'm going to give you somewhat of a step-by-step process on how you should begin relearning technique or learning proper technique. So what I mean by proper technique is coordinated, efficient, ergonomic piano technique at the keyboard. So technique that accounts for our bodies and how they move and work most efficiently. Now the first thing that we have to talk about is the concept of gesture. This is a very common thing that we talk about on the channel. You also may have come across this concept out there in the piano technique world online. It's a fairly common concept, and the concept of gesture is a concept of movement or whole arm motions, okay? So in the same way that a conductor doesn't just wiggle his fingers and move his baton, but he has gestures and movements that go all the way back to the shoulder. Interestingly enough, in the conducting class that I took at university, one of the things that the instructor focused on was how to move so that you don't get shoulder pain, which is directly kind of corresponds to piano. So how we move is important. If you think about any kind of sport or stretching, actually, or even yoga, right? That kind of form, lifting weights, it's very, very important. So it's the same when we play piano. So the concept of gesture is whole arm sort of movement. So the most basic kind of piano technique that we have, and this is what I do with all of my beginner students, okay? We start by learning how to do what I call an up-down gesture, just on single notes. So you start from above the keys and you go down and you play a key, just like so, okay? Now this works really well because in most beginner piano literature or method books, they don't teach legato or staccato or anything like that. They just have non-legato, right? So notes without any kind of other articulations. So we have a little bit of a breath in between each note. Sort of like that, okay? So this works perfect for this up-down gesture. Now, this is the great way to start also because it makes use of gravity, right? What goes up must come down. And also, it will naturally do two things, which is just beautiful. It will naturally make us move finger, hand, arm together. So notice how I do this, right? Notice how I do this. Everything just goes down together, up together and down together. The other thing that it will naturally start developing, even if the student is, say, 6, and the concept of arm weight is a little bit too abstract for them, it will naturally start developing the concept of sort of dropping into the key and sitting at the bottom of the key using that weight of the arm, okay? So it's really, really good to start at that point. And this is what I would do with every single student. It doesn't matter what they're playing. They're gonna play every note with an up-down gesture like that, okay? So just lifting and dropping into the notes, okay? Now we have to make sure that when we lift, we sort of have a little bit of a release. So this kind of goes back to, I've talked about this before, I call it like a swan's neck gesture. So when we lift, the wrist sort of releases, okay? Now this is very natural because when we move our hands and things like that, the hand and arm does not stay in a stiff sort of thing like this. There's a little bit of give, and that's basically what we're doing here. So we want to make sure that we lift above the keys, nothing is tense. We're not trying to hold that hand position. This also is good for that as well, because when we do that and we just focus on one single note, just one note at a time, preparatory movement up and just one single note, it sort of helps, because when we're on the surface of the keys and we think, okay, keep this hand position and then play this note and then play this note, it kind of doesn't communicate the idea one note at a time, focus on whatever finger you're playing. Don't worry if the 5th finger is over G, because you're not even gonna play that note. You're not even gonna play G in this piece of music that you're practicing. Super common problem that I see, and so this works really well for that. Now, we also want to make sure that we have good structure, so we want to make sure that we don't collapse when we play. Okay, so we have a nice rounded hand shape, the wrist doesn't collapse, etc. I have other videos that talk about this structure, so if you need a little bit of information on that. You can check out some of those videos. Now, the next thing we can do once that's fully well developed is we can learn to drop into one key like we're doing and then go to one more key. So without lifting, right? So I drop into the first note and then I just play the second note and then I lift, okay? So 2 notes at a time. Basically what I'm doing is I'm dropping into the keys, settling to the bottom of the key with my weight, and then I'm shifting my weight to the second key, and then I'm lifting. And this is basically kind of like a 2-note slur. So down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. Okay, now it helps when we do this to have a little bit more downward movement, so the wrist is a little bit lower, because then the upward movement, which is a little bit forward as well, helps to get that feeling of a shift. A whole arm movement, and more of a gesture that gets the arm to sort of shift with the finger and then deposit the weight into that finger, okay? Then we can, of course, do 3 notes at a time. Down, up, shift, okay? So obviously it depends on what we're playing. Now, if you're trying to develop this in your playing, let's say the music that you're playing doesn't have any slurs, it's just non-legato notes. Well, you could add in your own slurs, you could do that. Or if it does have some slur markings, you can just make up your own, okay? So this is actually quite simple to do. The next thing that you can do is you can try to do 4 notes. Once you can do 4 notes at a time well, I think then you can start doing longer slurs, okay? Now obviously if you're doing something where you have an octave passage, you know, scale passage like that, that gets a little bit more complicated, so that can be a little challenging. But that's kind of the idea. And probably before you get to octave scales anyways, you're going to actually start learning other gestures and patterns. So we talk about this a little bit on the channel, rotation. And that's that movement where our arm sort of rotates back and forth. Or we have sort of circular motion. So I'm sort of like tracing a circle, thing like that. And then of course I have things where my arm is a little bit more active and just moving laterally across the keyboard, etc. So once you've developed this in your playing so that you can drop into a note and then begin to transfer the weight naturally across 4 or 5 notes at a time, then and only then would I recommend that you start developing that rotational movement. Again, if you're not familiar with that, I have a number of videos discussing that. Then you can start developing that rotation as well as the circular gesture into your playing. Because I think that it's really important that you learn to release when you let go of the keys. You also learn to let go of the keys. Sometimes we have a death grip on the keyboard and we're afraid to just let go and lift, okay? And you learn to focus on 1 note at a time. That's very important. When your brain is focused on just this finger, these fingers will naturally just relax, interestingly enough, okay? If they don't for you, then maybe it requires a little bit more sort of thought and change how you're thinking about that. But often it will naturally just do that. So I'm just focusing on 1 finger at a time. I learn to drop into the key, settle my weight there. Then I can learn to shift that weight from finger to finger. And of course, this is probably the easiest way, and this is how I teach all of my students, to begin learning good ergonomic, coordinated playing at the keyboard that takes into account the way our bodies move and work most naturally. So if you are someone who's been playing for a number of years, I would still recommend that you develop in this way, your technique. Depending on if you've had problems and things like that, this is just a really good way to do that because it's very simple and easy. You don't have to think too hard about it, well, for the most part. And so it works really well. And even if you are a complete beginner, so this is generally how I would approach learning how to develop proper or good coordinated technique at the keyboard. So I hope this was interesting, informative. Most of all, I hope that it helps you in your practice. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them down below in the comments. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.